Good day, and thank you for participating in our webinar. My name is Vid Kartavicius, and I am the president of ComplyTec and another company called Carticorp. Just wanted to sort of quick introduction of the two companies. ComplyTec specializes in providing IT security solutions, and Carticorp focuses on integrated risk management, or formerly known as governance, risk, and compliance. The other thing that we've done that gives us some pretty good insight into your industry is that we have developed and implemented our NERC compliance management solution with various utilities across the United States. So just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. So during the webinar, please do not hesitate to ask questions at any time, and we'll be sure to get to all of your questions. And there's a feature on your screen, hopefully obvious, that is a Q&A feature. So please submit your questions, and we will definitely get you your answers that you're looking for. During the webinar, we also will be doing some polls, so we ask that everyone please participate. So getting started, since both of our companies, ComplyTec and Carticorp, are very focused on the utility sector, we thought it would be a great opportunity to provide some insight into some of the most significant risk exposures impacting electric utilities today. So in order to do this, we brought together two of the industry experts in operational technology and industrial control systems for a fireside chat about this topic. So I just introduced the panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce Marty Edwards. Marty and I met a couple years ago when we did a joint webinar for the Canadian Electric Association on a very similar topic. Marty is a vice president of operations technology at Tenable and past director of ICS for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Marty, could I ask you to maybe provide some further background information of your experience in this field?
Sure, thanks, Vid. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. Background-wise, I mean, I'm an industrial control systems engineer. I started out in Western Canada and then the Pacific Northwest of the US, designing, installing, maintaining, troubleshooting, mainly distributed control systems in pulp and paper and specialty chemical. And of course, pulp and paper has fairly large on-site cogeneration capabilities typically, and pretty healthy grid intertie systems. So fair amount of experience there. I got recruited out of that to join the US government. So I worked for the US Department of Energy as a contractor at Idaho National Laboratory, and then got recruited out of that role to be the director of the Industrial Control Systems CERT. Worked for the International Society of Automation, ISA, for a couple of years. If you're familiar with the ISA IEC 62443 cybersecurity standards, I know Dean is, and now have been at Tenable since November of 2019. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, Vid. I think you're muted, Vid.
Thank you, Marty. If you would like a copy of this presentation or this webinar later, we are going to record it, so we're happy to share it with you at a later date. So thanks, Marty. So the other gentleman that we have with us today is a gentleman named Dean Parsons. And Dean and I met a few years ago when he was an actual customer and was responsible for industrial control systems at Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro. So Dean has a very good understanding of the utility sector, and he currently is a ICS OT SANS instructor and critical infrastructure cybersecurity industry leader. So I was going to ask Dean to do the same thing, just to give everybody a little more insight on your background, Dean, please.
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks, Vid. Thanks, everybody, for letting me be here as well, part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to it. As Vid mentioned as well, we want your questions, so feel free to drop those in the Q&A area as we go, and we're going to get to those just as we get started here. A little bit of background on myself, though. Long story short, grew up hacking Linux, started writing C code, got a degree in computer science, spent about 10 years of my career and the first part of my career doing IT security in telecommunications. So I'd build teams there. I'd always do the technical IT work, the security work, incident response, but got used to building out teams, doing hunting, doing things like policies and procedures, and also reporting to the board. But don't let that scare you. I'm still very much involved in the technical side. For the last 11 years, though, I've been really focusing on OT and ICS specifically. So I've spent about 8 years in the electric sector specifically. So NERC and NERC SIP as an example, doing communications, but also security in generation, transmission, distribution of the electric sector in Atlantic Canada. Most recently, my ICS and OT experience has been on assessments for OT environments in the oil and gas, oil refineries, marine terminals, and so on and so forth. And as Vid mentioned, I'm a certified SANS instructor and author of 418, ICS 418, and I also teach ICS 515, which is incident response applicable to any ICS environment. So happy to be here, and back to you, Vid.
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Dean and Marty. I much appreciate you guys joining us today. So now I'm going to ask a few questions just to get started, just to get things rolling. And I'm going to first start off with my first question for Dean and Marty is compliance requirements and technology are really constantly changing all the time. And it's becoming at an all-time high in the industry in regards to these requirements. And I was just wondering from your perspective, because there's so many compliance requirements that keep just getting piled on, like it never seems to stop. There's always more regulations. And I know in the utility sector, everybody's dealing with NERC regulations that we're very familiar with. But given this, I'd like to hear from Marty and from Dean. What do you guys think are some of the biggest challenges for utilities when it comes to meeting these compliance requirements? Who wants to go first? Go ahead.
I guess I can take a swag at it and then turn it over to Dean. You're exactly right, Vid. We see regulatory agencies changing their or updating their requirements continuously, and of course, the cyber threat landscape evolves at a very rapid pace, right? So one of the big challenges I see is when departments and agencies, regulators try to get much too prescriptive with the technical controls, right? So you see updates, for example, in the United States, we saw the second iteration of the TSA security requirements come out, and there was quite a bit of industry pushback because they were trying to tell people how to do something rather than what they wanted to accomplish. And so, I think that if regulators can kind of step back and get a more objective set of requirements that aids industry in explaining what they want them to accomplish. This is the end state that we want to describe you to achieve. And then industry can go ahead and implement, a technology neutral kind of vendor agnostic methodology to meet those requirements using whatever technology they feel best is applicable for their scenario. So that's kind of, I guess, my opening statement, and then Dean can comment on that, and we can flip this one back and forth a few times.
Absolutely. So I'll speak to some of the challenges that utilities in the electric sector are facing today when it comes to NERC SIP compliance or any kind of regulatory regime for critical infrastructure protection. So I'll kind of speak to the NERC SIP stuff. There's a few of these things I kind of want to walk through. So I'll kind of just say one and kind of brief that and pivot into the next. But if we're talking about the challenges, one of the things that I see when I'm teaching or do assessments is the awareness on the unique components and controls of the industrial control system. So specifically at a substation, as an example, there's engineering devices there. And so the good news is when compliance comes in, then boards of directors, owner operators of facilities and generation, transmission, distribution are asking now the right questions. What are we doing for security in the substations? What about the generating station, and so on and so forth? So the challenge is awareness. Because the questions are being asked, who's doing security in the substation, some of the answers are IT security is doing that. And that's great if someone is doing that. But the thing is that there's a unique challenge of understanding the OT environment. And if, unfortunately, we take IT security controls, people, process, and technology, and copy and paste them into the ICS, we're going to break things. So awareness is the big thing that I'm seeing, and how to, I guess, make sure that the board of directors and whoever's responsible for doing industrial control system securities know the differences between IT security and OT, but how to use what we've been using for decades in IT security and taking what works from there and then adapting it to the ICS. So awareness is one of the challenges. The other thing I really find is a challenge, but don't worry, there's positivity here coming up, is the resources and scoping. So we are requiring people to implement these controls, these technical controls, but also the policies, procedures, going back to aligning with compliance. So where do we get these people who understands that safety is number one? Where do we get these people who understand how the engineering devices work? So the next challenge beyond awareness is really resources and scope. But this is not all bad news, because NERC and NERC CIP specifically have guidance on your scope. So for example, if you have medium, low, or high BES sites, then you can tailor your security requirements based on those sites and what NERC and NERC CIP deems those sites to be. And when we talk about a cyber asset, it's not necessarily a traditional Windows system running engineering software. So the idea of a cyber asset, as NERC says, can guide you through this as well. So just to kind of summarize this before I pass it back to Marty, awareness for sure, differences in IT and ICS for sure. The next one would be resources and scope. Again, the guidance provided through compliance will kind of give us a place to start. And of course, those resources should, in my perspective, understand the safety and reliability of operations is king or queen, and security supports that. So but defense is doable. And if you were to ask me if IT is easier to defend than ICS, I would say that ICS environments are probably easier to defend against, given the right technologies, for sure.
Yeah, and all great points, Dean. You know, I think that what I would emphasize in my experience is that, you know, people tend to try to put technology before the people in this sort of solution set, and it sounds sort of weird coming from somebody who's a technology provider, right? But you shouldn't just go out and buy the black box with blinky blue lights and throw it in the substation and expect all your problems to go away. You know, you really need to invest in the people. So I've been talking a lot recently about the fact that I don't really necessarily think that an organization, if you look across their enterprise, corporate, and now OT environments, needs to invest more in cybersecurity across the board. I think they just need to prioritize those investments better. You know, we've put all this money on the enterprise side or the corporate side to do cybersecurity education and prioritization of the technologies, you know, to deploy. And now chief information security officers are being told essentially by their bosses, by their chief executive officers that, hey, you're responsible and accountable for the security of everything, not just the enterprise side, but including our operations side. And so I think that what I'd like to see is companies kind of evaluate where are their crown jewels, right? Where are the systems that make them the money? And typically in electrical utility, that's moving electrons from, you know, the generation to their customers or consumers. And so, you know, harden and protect that infrastructure as a priority vis-a-vis kind of, you know, walking around playing whack-a-mole on the enterprise side, you know. And I tend to agree with you. I think that the OT environments because they're more highly engineered, or I don't want to use the term rigid because some of them are quite dynamic. But I think we have, if you get the right people involved, we have a good understanding of what happens in those environments. I don't think it's a technology issue. 15 years ago, if you would have had me on this webinar, we didn't have sort of customized or bespoke technology to monitor and detect in these environments, but we do now. And so I think it's a will to invest. We're not choosing to invest wisely, and we're trying to put the cart before the horse with technology versus people.
Totally agree. And through my assessments, what I do realize fairly quickly is that an organization, they're watching the news, they're getting threat intelligence, and they say that, ICS security is a thing, and that's great. Focusing on the threat intelligence, the more impactful facts, of course. But then they come to me and they say, thanks for the assessment. And what do you think we should do first in our roadmap? Because we now have, $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million. And the first thing is, let's look at your architecture, right? Because whenever you get the people, and then of course you build on top of that, the technology for the people to use, is your network architected correctly to make the most value of that technology, right? So it's really, I start at the basics of architecting the industrial control system network specifically as best you can, and then building on top of that. I couldn't agree more with you with having the people that use the technology. One of the things you mentioned, Marty, which was brilliant, is where do you find those crown jewels? And just looking at the chat here as well, we got a question on this. So here's the thing: we can use technology to help us determine what assets are on the network. We can do that actively or passively, so safer, for example. But it's if you are a person using the technology, that's only going to get you halfway there. Ultimately, the people interacting with the engineers at site who understand the control systems and having that conversation of, well, this generator over here, if that goes down, what happens to the business? What happens to the environment? What happens to safety of people in the plant and elsewhere who we service? And so that conversation using the technology is going to be helping with identifying those crown jewels. So as you mentioned, whatever the things that are making the money or making the environment safe and secure, starting there, protecting those devices first. And technically, they're probably going to be the top 4 or 5 devices. The human machine interface, which our engineers and operators at the plants use regularly to view the control system and change it. And also even things like, obviously, the programmable logic controllers, the digital engineering devices not running traditional operating systems are some of those critical assets. And this goes well beyond this, of course, as well. But looking at the question, we have an individual here that says he or she has just moved into ICS security and creating a program specifically for ICS defense, and they will be reporting up to the board of directors. So which assets should that person have their technical team protect first? So I mentioned a couple there. Marty, where would you start from here on advice for this person?
Yeah, it's a great question. So thank you, Raquel, for asking it. Agree totally with Dean, right? You need to have an understanding of which system of systems is most important in your environment. So, that could be a particular generating station that is your most efficient, for example, and provides you the lowest cost energy into the system. It could be a particular pinch point in transmission, right, where you've got a narrow spot in the wire that you're trying to push everything through, and if you lose that, it's going to impact your operation. So typically you need to get the financial and the business risk people involved, right? They can usually tell you, so to speak, where those crown jewels lie. And once you've gone in and identified that, that particular asset, and when I talk about asset, I'm talking about, that building or that factory or that station or substation, whatever group of devices and systems that make up that business asset, then you need to go in and do an inventory of what cyber assets support that operation. So it's kind of a system of systems approach, right? And Dean's right. There's technology that can help you to, look on the network to identify those assets. There's ways to then input the sort of asset criticality rating so that your system that you're using knows which devices are most critical in your application. And then I think you have to go into kind of the standard set of vulnerability analysis, right? Where are those systems at the most risk? And I tend to think that those are the systems that are the most exposed, from a cyber exposure perspective. So often they're the systems that are in your demilitarized zones, or the systems that interconnect the different layers of the Purdue model together. And then kind of just prioritize through there. Or perhaps maybe you'll find some very risky legacy assets that it may not be a cybersecurity risk that you end up mitigating. It might be if this thing breaks, we have 0 spare parts and we're never going to get a spare because the manufacturer's out of business. So you have to look at it. I think you have to look at it from, I use the concept cyber maintenance, right? You have to kind of look at, how do I maintain the cybersecurity envelope of these systems? And you can apply some maintenance and reliability best practices there.
A couple things I want to just pivot off of. You mentioned Purdue and network and maybe hotspots like the demilitarized zone between the remote networks that may be connected into your control system for a vendor coming in to do troubleshooting or maintenance, as an example, but also the hotspot of that demilitarized remote access system that people may be coming into, or connections coming into or out to the IT network as well. From an incident response perspective, which is a lot of what I do in ICS, it's, we roll the sites with jump bags and we do analysis and things of this nature. And we always try to focus on, well, what kind of sector are we in? What have we seen in this sector before that the adversary has been seen, targeting which devices? So specific ICS sector, or sector specifically, electric sector threat intelligence can really help you understand what devices are commonly targeted. Now, when I'm talking about an asset in this context, I'm talking about those digital devices on the plant floor that runs the plant, not so much those assets that are your transformers and so on and so forth, or your CTs. But you leveraging threat intelligence, we found from an engineering perspective and incident response perspective, critical. Starting with threat intelligence, picking the top 5, if you will, targeted devices, the engineering workstation that organizations are using and engineering are using to reprogram and get information from endpoints, or change how the factory runs is targeted, as we know. And just back to the point that Marty mentioned earlier about the demilitarized zone, commonly we do see fairly good architecture between, well, not all the time, but good architecture, we hope, between IT and ICS. But there is a critical asset between these environments that is kind of a trusted asset, which is commonly abused, according to threat intelligence, which is the data historian shares information about, in this case, how much electricity are we generating? What's the demand? What's the load from our residential customers, our industrial customers? So that device shares information with the IT and the business side as well. So back to that question about some of the critical assets, I would absolutely prioritize that digital on the network asset, the data historian as well. Yeah, go for it, Marty.
I would be remiss in providing advice, I think, to this individual if I didn't talk about, and it was your discussion about incident response that kind of jigged me back into shape there. And that was, the very first thing you should do is ensure that you have a very sound disaster recovery plan and backups, offline backups for each and every device that you have in your network, including configuration backup, right? So the settings inside of those devices, right? Things like the switching infrastructure, the PLCs, the HMI, all of that stuff you need to have. Like, I can't emphasize this enough, right? The biggest threat that we're seeing right now across the board is ransomware. And when that stuff gets encrypted, many times, and like NotPetya, I think, was a great example of this, right? There was no way to decrypt it, right? So it's like, if that gets on your network, you better have a great disaster recovery plan. And, so I just wanted to put that shout out there.
No, absolutely. I think from an engineering perspective, I found that the traditional Windows systems may have a solution in place already for backups. When it comes down to remote terminal units, meters, configuration, as you mentioned, to protection control relays or PLCs, It's where's that stored? And a lot of times when I do assessments, I find that the vendor has a copy of that. And it's like, okay, so you have to factor in your response, in your DR or disaster recovery. It's how do you get access to the vendor if they are the ones supporting, programming, maintaining your critical endpoints and assets in OT. So yeah, that they need to be included in your disaster recovery plans and your tabletops as well. Great points.
Yeah. Could
I see oh, go ahead, Vid. I was going to ask, I see we have another question in the chat. But...
Yeah, well, I think you guys are being a little modest, especially Marty, in some ways. We don't want this to be an advertisement for Tenable, but there's a lot of questions in regards to how do you figure out where your assets are and what are your critical assets. So, and I think the last couple of questions are really kind of leading in that direction. So I don't want you to spend a lot of time selling the Tenable solution, but at least maybe give the audience a bit of a perspective of how a tool like Tenable could help them identifying their assets and what is critical.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right. My apologies, my phone rang and took over my headset. That's unusual. I try not to make that happen. Anyway, the question in the chat was, what is the best approach for conducting an ICS and engineering assets inventory? And you're right, I try to not overly promote Tenable's products on these types of webinars, because I believe that, everybody should select their technology on its best merits. So Dean had mentioned earlier, the concept of passively monitoring your networks to determine what devices are there. And certainly that's been the historical approach, right? Is to try to put sensors and that on your environments so that you can determine through analysis of network traffic what the devices are. I'll tell you that Tenable's customers tell us that is not enough, that these devices are sometimes silent or very low noise environments. So, they tend not to speak unless spoken to. And so Tenable, as well as some of the other providers in this space, have now moved to more of a query type of application. And that's where, Tenable patented and pioneered basically the method of speaking to these devices in their own native protocols. So if you have a Schneider implementation or a GE implementation, we actually use the vendor's own protocols to go out and ask these devices. And in many cases, we can put a broadcast packet on the network that says, hey, all Allen Bradley controllers, please wake up and report in. And then they will report in and say, oh, hello, I'm a version such and such running the following firmware. And that way we get a very accurate and up-to-date asset inventory without having to, put sensors deep down into the network. As long as we have a routable path to the device, we can elicit a response, a safe and reliable response. So this is not scanning your network for devices, right? This is having a very engineered conversation with the devices to determine what they are. So that's the first, I think, data point. The second data point, Dean has mentioned several times that, you'll have contemporary engineering workstations, historians, they're running Windows, right? They're running commercial off-the-shelf operating systems. And so what we specifically did is we moved the capability to run Nessus in a safe mode on those devices. So we basically, using the capability to talk with the industrial devices, build a deny list. And we say, okay, here's all of these sensitive industrial devices. Nessus, you're not allowed to talk to them, but you can go out and talk to these other assets on the network. And so in that fashion, we believe that we provide the best overall solution to really address these hybrid networks where you're seeing it's a mix, it's IT stuff, but it's on the OT side of the firewall. And you don't want to reach through that firewall with your enterprise vulnerability management scanners, to try to address that. Dean said badness will happen, right? So, use the technology that's purpose-built, and then you can ingest all that into your CMDB and start managing those assets appropriately.
Every time I hear the conversation of asset inventory or identifying critical systems, obviously the question comes up about active vulnerability scans, with which Marty eloquently kind of spoken to. I think from my perspective of using the Tenable OT tool, it always reminds me of we're the defenders, and now this is our chance to live off the land. So what I mean by that is a lot of time the adversaries are now getting into control systems, and your standard AV on a Windows endpoint at the high level of Purdue is unlikely going to detect malicious activity because the adversaries are living off the land, which means they're using the system and system protocols in the industrial network against us. So it's not malicious, but they're using it with malicious intent. So back to the OT environment and back to Tenable's OT scanning tool or inquiry tool, if you will. It queries the devices using basic and understood, tried, true, and tested industrial kind of protocols, which again, this is our chance as defenders to live off the land and speak what the protocols are naturally are on the environment legitimately. This is a far cry from the legacy active scanning, which in the past with other tools have tipped over devices because those devices didn't understand how to respond to aggressive scanning. So yeah, and there's other ways to do asset inventory. I won't spend too much time on this, but back to the point about people and hiring the right people and training the right people, getting your security team to the plant floor in hard hats, with knee pads and the whole thing, all that stuff is critical because and my bias is incident response. When you do incident response, you're relying not only on your security team, but the engineers at site as well. So why I think it's important to get to site to do asset inventory is you create those relationships with the engineers at site as you're literally walking through the environment, finding the racks, finding the engineering devices with embedded operating systems and so on. And that's another great way to, I would suggest, augmenting your passive traffic scanning to identify assets because of those other benefits you get when you need to do incident response. So donuts and coffee with meetings on the plant floor goes a long way to understand what crown jewels are out there.
For sure. Donuts and coffee when you show up at the plant, and beer and pizza when you leave the plant for the night, right? Those combination of those two work well. Just a note as it was flying by in the chat there about Dean, you had mentioned, the CVSS scoring mechanism, and as the director of the ICS CERT, I managed basically the United States team that coordinated all those vulnerabilities, and all of these OT vulnerabilities tend to be scored at 8, 9, or 10, right? They're all like severe. So you can't really address all of them, and we've almost done ourselves a disservice, I think, by trying to chase the vulnerability management sort of regime. Inside of the Tenable products, we use a capability that we call VPR, Vulnerability Prioritization Rating. And so what that's doing is taking threat intelligence feeds from all over the world. And my boss, who's the Chief Technology Officer of Tenable, explains it best. And the way he explains is it is the likelihood that any given vulnerability will be exploited in the next 28 days. So we're actually like looking forward into the threat intelligence so that we'll prioritize that information to give to you. And we've moved that essentially enterprise capability over into the OT product as well. So, all of those vulnerabilities and that are being scored so that you can get essentially a prioritized list of what you should be addressing first.
I don't want to turn this conversation into like patching the ICS and vulnerability management, but it's a really good point that we're all inundated with threat intelligence or advisories to say, go patch this. Icefall, for example, broke a couple days ago. Lots of vulnerabilities in critical components in the industrial sectors, all engineering devices and on non-traditional operating systems. So I always bring up the point about this. If we can protect our human-machine interface from unauthorized remote access, we're in a really good spot because adversaries will likely get in, and we've seen this before, get access to the human-machine interface, whether it's directly connected to the internet or they pivoted from shared credentials from IT into the ICS, living off the LAN and directly using the human-machine interface that the operators use against itself. So, a vulnerability on the HMI and patching the vulnerability versus how do we control access to the HMI are very different things. So while I think patching is important, including the HMI, it's not necessarily going to save you, because you can have a fully patched HMI and you can have cached credentials somewhere in the environment, stolen credentials that the adversary uses to legitimate a connection to the HMI and directly shut down the system, or overload or trip breakers and so on and so forth. So patching, definitely important. I'm not saying don't patch. I'm saying the guidance back to compliance is helpful for prioritizing the assets and patching in a safe window. And NERC and NERC-CIP will say you'll have to patch, or at least acknowledge patching that's required within 35 days. And 35 days after that, have a plan to either mitigate those or have some other mitigating plan in place to patch or increase monitoring and so forth. So patching is important. Compliance is important, but practical use of security is also prioritization of safety. So
For sure. No arguments here.
So excellent conversation. Thank you. And I was going to please, audience, throw in any questions that you might have. But I might move on to the next question that I had. And I'd love to hear from Marty and Dean on your sort of perspective on this, which we've kind of already touched on. But security breaches are definitely, ransomware and people, sort of the vulnerabilities within Active Directory and all of this stuff is and getting much more. The actors are getting much more sophisticated in regards to how they're targeting utilities. And I just wanted to sort of get from your perspective, what do you think that utilities need to do to be secure and compliant, to try to protect themselves from all of what's going on in the industry today?
yeah, so I'll jump at this one, and there's not just one thing. I think that if an organization or someone is now newly responsible for ICS or OT security, I think there's a huge benefit that will jump your program maturity forward if you align with the safety culture at a plant. So let me just kind of back up a little bit. In an engineering environment, there is a huge focus on physical safety, of keeping people safe. Like when you go to work, you're in a hard hat. It's a different environment than in the office, right? So the safety culture is fantastic. And so what I've done in the past is I've shamelessly leveraged that amazing culture to say, you know what, security supports safety and reliability of operation. If we have a technology that says there's some kind of misconfiguration here, it might not be security related, but there's a safety thing here that we need to prioritize. And this visibility into the network can help us. That's supporting safety. So I would say, first and foremost, align with the physical safety culture of the engineering side of the house. They really need to understand that from a security perspective, you are not there to come in and lock stuff down, or be the police person to say, you can't have access to that. It's how does security help with understanding visibility on the network, and how does security and ICS specifically support that mission of keeping the lights on? I think what really I'm trying to say is using the culture from a people perspective, then leveraging technology to get the engineering and security visibility to say, you know what, we've seen something here, it's not security related, or if it is, here's what we can do. So the culture in general will push forward the people, process, and technology, and put your program in a place where you can actually do visibility and an incident response, and then recover when you need to as well, to trusted restoration points. Now, I know that's a lot coming out of this question. From a technical perspective, I'd say do architecture first, and then the culture and all of those things should align moving forward. Critical to get culture on the side.
Yeah, absolutely. So I couldn't agree more with the kind of leveraging of the safety culture and concept. And one of the biggest examples I use, and I have a love-hate relationship with it, is the InfoSec or the IT community. It tends to run these punitive testing regimes, right? So you get the phishing email that says, oh, hey, click here for a free tank of gas, and you're busy and you're working on 89 reports, and you go, oh, wow, this is cool. And you click on it, and then all of a sudden it's like you get the hand slap, and you have to go take remediary training for like how not to click on phishing links. That's like punishing people, right? And I've heard that there have been several companies, and I know one at least was a utility company, that said, hey, 3 strikes and you're out. You click on this phishing thing and you fail it 3 times, you're fired, you're terminated. Now let's look at the safety culture. In safety, everybody is empowered to speak up about an unsafe condition. We almost celebrate those near misses as, oh, wow, look at this. This person stepped forward and showed us that there was a deficiency in our procedure here, and we created an unsafe condition. They did the right thing. They stopped work. We evaluated it. We've changed the engineering control, or we've changed the procedure. And so it's a very positive thing. I'd like to see us shift, our sort of security mindset into more of a positive safety culture. So that's point number 1. So break. Point number 2 is, you can actually use these monitoring technologies and capabilities to help you with non-security related aspects in your system. And so what I mean by that is, when we were querying and communicating with these devices using their own native protocols, we actually determined that we can ask them for their configuration. So in many cases, we can actually take a snapshot of the running ladder logic in these programmable logic controllers and monitor for configuration changes. This helps you with insider threat types of scenarios, and it also helps you just in plain old human error, right? Somebody makes a mistake, or an attacker or malicious person is trying to change something, under the radar. So, I mean, you can use these capabilities in a much broader application, and that really helps, I have found, sell the concept of installing these kinds of systems, selling that to the engineers and the technicians that are sort of the boots on the ground people. Then the last comment was, there was a question in the chat that went by that said, what do we do first? We've just inherited a new budget. I'm a big advocate of using the NIST cybersecurity framework, so look at that sort of life cycle of cybersecurity. There's been a lot of attention lately on detection of threats or events in your environment, and incident response and disaster recovery. And I believe that those are important, but I also believe it's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse. You have to understand your network and your environment, and we can't forget about sort of the basic cybersecurity fundamentals, right? Like evaluating your network to see if you have any clear text, easy passwords that, that should not be in devices, right? So you have to kind of scrub your environment for that. And I recommend, kind of following some of those overarching architectures.
Main takeaways I'm hearing so far is definitely aligned with safety, definitely donuts and coffee, and the OT Tenable solution will help you understand what's in the network. When we deployed it for the first time, we did not find the next advanced persistent threat. We did not find ransomware. It took us like 6 months to do that because we never had an impact. So when we did see it, it was immediate. But for the first 6 months after we deployed it, we actually seen configuration errors where meters and the engineering devices were not talking the same protocol, different mismatched communications and so on. So really network troubleshooting, engineering troubleshooting was the main benefit we seen first. But with that, as a security team rolling out a security device to look at the network, we took that the packet information or the network data and the traffic captures, we took that to the engineering team from the ICS security team and said, we found this. Is this helpful to you? And back to the culture, the engineers were like, wow, we've been looking for this for like months, and you just figured this out with this new tool. Like, that's awesome. And all of a sudden, all the coffee is gone, all the donuts are gone, and now you're building relationships, right? So a lot of benefits from that perspective.
Yeah, it's a huge, huge win. And I can't stress that enough, that once you get visibility into these networks, you're going to find all kinds of stuff. If you have hired the people to actually participate in a hands-on fashion, right? Don't just go buy the box with blinky blue lights and drop it on the network and expect like the light to turn red once every 5 months to tell you, oh, there's an emergency that you need to fix. It's like these systems need daily care and feeding. I think the other caveat that I would put in there is that a lot of companies, and I hope there's some executives on the line here, a lot of companies will try to dual hat their control system engineers as the security people. That they need to work together in the same team, but you need to have people that are dedicated to just the security of these environments. You really, the people that are trying to keep the plant running or keep the lights on are not the same people who should be trying to secure it. It's not necessarily a conflict of interest because they have to work together, but they just don't have the bandwidth and their priorities are different.
I'm all for the ICS specific defenders who not only know security, but know safety and engineering. That's a good mixture or recipe for someone doing, I would say, modern industrial control system defense. We got a question in the Q&A section here I want to bring up because it ties directly into what we're talking about. And the question is, do you have any thoughts on a solid return of investment specific to ICS tabletops? So which tabletops would you kind of recommend? And this not only combines the things we've been talking about so far, like the people who's going to be sitting at the table for a tabletop, your engineers, obvious. IT security, for sure. You're also going to have your physical safety staff, your engineering folks at the plant sitting at the same table. The question is, what scenario will you run through in that tabletop? And I also suggest the VP of engineering stakeholders, owner-operators of the plant should be sitting there as well. So of course, running a ransomware scenario is definitely going to be beneficial. However, I do not think that ransomware alone is the best scenario to run because traditional ransomware we've seen focuses on some types of traditional operating systems. Some stuff is focused as well on applications running on some of these devices. But it's likely not, ransomware is likely not going to be the scenario that says, is the adversary spoofing my devices or abusing the technology we have in place today? So I don't think that it's just ransomware. So to answer that question, I think ransomware is a great place to start to make sure that IT security is sitting there, the business is talking about what's in the news, and then like run that one. And then immediately after run, if our protocols in the network are being abused, align it with something like the Trisis event, crash override, pipe dream event, those recent events in the electric sector. Those are where your engineers are going to say, you know what, we don't have visibility in the network. That's what we need. Or, yeah, we are running that protocol. We didn't think we were before, but we're running that protocol and it's been abused given the threat intelligence we've seen. So you asked for one, those are two, ransomware and abuse of protocols.
I'll add that those are great suggestions, Dean. You know, in my experience, the tabletops are really, really valuable. But you have to ask the hard questions, right? You just can't sort of play through it. You actually have to ask the questions like, okay, so what happens if that backup that you think is working doesn't work? Here's an inject. Your backup is now corrupted. It does not work, you know, and work through, use the opportunity, right? The other observation I would have is exercises and tabletops are a really, really good opportunity to engage with your government partners, right? So if you're in the United States, you know, this is a good opportunity to leverage either the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, DOE, or if you're in Canada, Public Safety Canada, I know is working on some similar things. So, you know, use it as an opportunity to reach across to your government partner and say, hey, would you like to participate in this? We'd like to have you at the table. And they might be able to bring a significant set of assets to bear, like, and actually run the exercise for you. So you're almost just sitting there as they're playing the scenario out.
Cool. I'm going to sort of try to move on to the last question I had. And I appreciate all of the comments. And I was just going to ask if people could do a quick fill out the poll that's posted on the screen here. That would be much appreciated. But I got one last question. We only got about 10 minutes left, so I would like to get through one thing that seems to be really happening in the industry today is that, you know, the OT systems used to be air gapped from the rest of the sort of the rest of the IT environment, and there was no real concerns there, but there is a big convergence happening now between the IT and the OT sectors. And I just wanted to get, we only got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to give you guys 3 or 4 minutes each. But what is on the minds of people, and what is happening from an IT OT convergence point of view? Marty, maybe you can go first to give us a Cole's version of what do you think is happening there. I know you can't do it in 4 minutes, but Give it a try.
It's impossible for me to talk and not consume more than 4 or 5 minutes. You know, convergence has some emotional attachment by different people. You know, people will argue that convergence should not happen. You know, that these systems should remain air gapped. I'm going to tell you that I think that argument's over. You know, in many cases, these systems have been converged. Now, if you know, there are technologies available that if you feel that you should not have any external connectivity to an environment, you know, put in a one-way unidirectional data diode type of solution to push the data out of that environment. My personal feeling is that visibility, real-time continuous visibility into these environments is far more useful and far easier or better to maintain the security and the reliability of the networks than to try to manage the air gap. And look, I've worked in national security types of installations where, you know, you have to go through metal detectors and the person wands you down to make sure you don't have a USB stick or a cell phone or something like that. You can maintain air gapped environments, but it's incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. So my pitch, and you know, it's not because I work for a detection or visibility vendor. I believe this is the truth, and that's you need to instrument and put sensors in these environments. You can backhaul the data out through out-of-band networks, right? You don't have to connect the two networks together to put sensors on each of them and gather that into an analysis type of environment. But you should be monitoring what's happening in these environments in a real-time basis.
Good point. Dean.
Yeah, so I'm just going to echo very quickly, monitoring and access at the lower levels of the Purdue, ideally from like 0.1 to at least 3.5. So all the remote access into the environment. But below that, how the devices, the engineering devices are interacting, critical. All those ICS protocols, any solution you select should have ICS aware dissectors in it to get what's happening at the control level. So definitely visibility. The question is really around the convergence. So we've actually converged technology 20 years ago. We've converged technology decades ago in the ICS, which means we have run traditional operating systems for the benefit of the control system with engineering software running on these devices, which to most IT solutions looks like it's malicious. We're really now in the conversation of the convergence of teams and skills, which I go back to one of the first points I had today on the call, which was really we're looking for and need people in critical infrastructure for all of our substations and so on in the electric sector and elsewhere to understand security in general, how it's applied, how to defend against cybersecurity attacks in general. We need to build on top of that for ICS security and require them to understand safety is the priority first, and then understand the protocols and engineering devices that you'll never find in an IT environment. So have we converged on technology? Yes, decades ago. We need to converge and understand how we get resources together for the purposes of the ICS environment, right? Where we're not going to be doing phishing scams all the time. It's important to do that, but we're focusing on the critical devices and how they communicate and the integrity of that information. So I think that we've converged, and I think that in general, we have to be aware of the converged network points. So Marty talked about the DMZ, critical to monitor devices in there, critical to have firewalls and architecture to make sure that nothing is bleeding over from the IT network or to and from the internet. A lot of times when I do assessments and we do convergence, we talk about where is the ability for remote access into the ICS and out. And I look at devices that are communicating with an established connection to the internet, right? And how that's potentially malicious and kind of go from there. So convergence, it's happened, there's lots of benefits. We need to make sure we get visibility.
Cool. Thank you so much. So any other questions, audience, please submit them. One last question for Dean that I have is that a real license plate behind you?
Yeah, the Unix. I grew up on Unix, so and Linux. So yeah, I have not put it on my car or motorcycle because I don't want to get dirt on it. But I've had it forever.
It is cool, very cool. All right. Well, I see the poll came up here, and thank you for responding. Yeah, looks like people are hiring people, which is something that Dean and Marty have been talking a lot about. You got to hire the right people to manage this this risk And yeah, so I think that's really what comes out of this is probably the biggest thing is getting the right people to manage the program. And then it's not the tools that is going to do it for you. You need the people to do it, but the tools can help. Is that sort of a valid statement? Yeah.
That
Yeah,
and
you know,
donuts and coffee.
and donuts and coffee. Yeah, you know, I say often that, you know, I'm a control systems engineer, right? My training and my entire career was spent automating and making things work more efficiently using automation tools. We're really bad at using automation to automate security, right? We should be using our own skills to make the security process better and use the tools that we have. But, you know, we tend not to apply ourselves in that way. We just expect some sort of magic easy button to show up and it'll all go away. It's not going to go away. This is hard work and we have to do it.
Yeah, I lost the poll, but I think the last one that seemed to get a lot of hits was, and I don't understand this, you guys are the experts, but this passive monitoring or passive, what was that? I don't know, Liz, can you put that back up? Or did you guys see that last? Oh, there we go. Using passive network capture.
Yeah, that's what we've been speaking of, which is a way to get visibility, understanding what's happening in the control network without putting risk into control network, right? So understanding what the assets are doing, what the crown jewels are, et cetera, what's being abused, but it's in a passive way. Love it, right? Prioritizing safety, right?
It's certainly applicable, right? But I will stress that today's technology can communicate with these devices in a very safe and reliable fashion, and you're going to get far better data. Most of the passive tools simply are guessing at what they see going along the network, parsing that out and going, well, I think this was the firmware version because it's supposed to show up in this packet this way. Whereas if you ask the controller that specific question using the vendor protocol, what is your firmware version? 1.7. You get the answer that you want.
Cool. All right. Well, that was really great. Thank you. And thank you for everybody to joining in on the conversation today. I hope you learned something. As you can tell, Marty and Dean are very knowledgeable in this space. So if there's any further discussions or if you want any further information, we're happy to engage on that. But I just wanted to give a big shout out to Marty and Dean. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It's really great to see you guys, and it's great to participate in an event like this today. And I hope I hope that we can keep all of these plants up and running and reliable. That's really our goal here, is to make sure that we're keeping things up and running and reliable on all critical infrastructure type things. So thank you, everyone. I don't see any other questions at this point, so I think we got 3 minutes to get back to you. All right. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Take care.
All the best.
Thanks,
everyone.
Vid, for sponsoring. Bye-bye.
Thanks.